Um, so welcome folks to our replicated deep dive series. This is our second session. We're going to be talking about deploying commercial Helm charts in enterprises today. I have with me from Replicated a few folks, including two members of the Helm team, who are also members of our Replicated staff, and one kitty cat who keeps one of them company. We are. I was thinking through sort of how I might start this off today. And when I think about Helm, one of the things I always think about is how it's been absolutely amazing the way Helm has standardized how we distribute and deploy open source software. In the Kubernetes world, especially. And there's sort of an open question whether those the same practices that have made Helm so amazing for that um, lead to the same success in distributing uh, commercial software to enterprises. I have a strong opinion that the answer is yes, but with some thinking. So let me ask Evans. What do you think about you've spent a lot of time, working within the Helm community, working with a lot of software vendors that work with Replicated, even working with those vendors' customers. What are some of your sort of key insights into things we have to think about for Helm when we're taking these commercial products and shipping them to big enterprises?
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. Yeah, I usually work with uh, with vendors in reviewing their Helm charts, reviewing their deployments, and some of the things that you'll notice that your sort of general way of packaging Helm charts that you won't see is when you'd like to ship to a vendor, they have many you have many assumptions of what they would expect to see, and there are many things that you shouldn't assume. Of course, we do have a checklist of many aspects of how to package your Helm chart, but most of them that you see vendors not consider is deploying your Helm chart in, say, an air gap environment, or an environment where not the users are not very much or the environment are not very well enabled for your setup, your way of packaging Helm charts and deploying those Helm charts. So yeah, we do have a list of things. I think we have a blog as well, which I'll drop here in the chat if that's all right. Probably Ali hasn't seen it, or people in the audience may not, who will watch this may not have seen it, but that's it. It has quite a lot of gotchas and aspects to think about.
Yeah, and what are if you think about the conversations you've had with folks, is there anything that you know, like I think about security contexts and the permissions that they request in the cluster, labeling requirements, annotations requirements, and those I think are some of the things that are talked about in that blog post that Diamond wrote. Um, is there any like sequencing of how I might approach these types of things? Is it an all or nothing? Like do this stuff, excuse me, do all this stuff to make your chart ready for enterprise deployments, or is it something you can sort of like incrementally get to? I don't know, Evan, Scott, even Ali, if you have any thoughts on that.
Evans, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in general there are some things. Well, there are some things that you would need to do in concert together, um, that are specific to Replicated. But in terms of all of the recommendations for making your charts enterprise ready, my understanding is those would be incremental. Those could be incremental improvements. Um, think of it almost as a progressive delivery approach. Uh, for your charts themselves, not for the application, but I believe that like each of the recommendations will, again, apart from specific things like including the replicated SDK or other things that are specific to, say, the replicated registry license piece of this. Those are things that are needed, but I think that you have specific dividends that you can get from each recommendation.
Yeah.
And so you can do those as they make sense for you. Evans, does that
Yeah.
sound correct to you?
Yeah, that sounds correct. There isn't a prescribed way of doing things. We do have categories, so for example, of how you should approach while packaging, and then recommendations of within those categories. Part of what you'll see in that blog post, but also for the audience here, is you first need to write your Helm chart, right? And then we do have lots of categories.
Good place to start for sure, Evans.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, you first need to write your Helm chart, right? Before thinking of deployment and all that, you need to have a Helm chart that works in certain ways. Now, we've talked. Chuck has talked about security context. You, I think, alluded to now how you want to what information you'd like to expose from a Helm chart, and we talk about that because then having a Helm chart that's configurable, that doesn't have certain assumptions, or say when you package your Helm chart, you have a way of how you think an image's reference should look like, right? Now, not everyone would have, say, one variable for the entire image reference, or combine an image name and a tag and a repository the same way you'd want to. Now, you want to expose that to the user, and then they can combine them the way they want to. So some may have default registry and want to tag their releases differently. They may have different repositories from Docker Hub, from an internal registry, from an air gap registry. So these kind of things are details that you may not think of when you're packaging your Helm chart. Security context. Some environments are very security sensitive. You want to expose that information for your Helm chart to be configurable in that way. Now, all these are aspects that you start thinking of when you're writing the Helm chart. Now, that is, I mean, I could go into details of all this, so stop me whenever, Chuck.
Well, no, there's one that's on our recommendations, and it's first, and I think it's on that blog post that Diamond wrote and the talk he gave earlier about this, about labels and annotations. And it's interesting because sitting in a software company and maybe even running a SaaS in a software company, how I label and how I annotate my workloads is often very different than a large enterprise thinks about that, right? If I worked at a large financial for about 6 years, and you know what one of the most important things are there, that's a word I have never heard in most of the software companies I've worked at: chargebacks. And labels and annotations are often required, labels especially, to figure out who owns something in order to do the chargebacks, or who owns something in order to, when something's when a workload's misbehaving, to find out who's responsible for it. When I'm operating it as a software company, as a SaaS, I've got, my SRE team and my engineering team, and one line of cogs that goes to selling, running the SaaS. It's a very different world, and I might not think about labels or annotations at all. So it's really a difference in the way, you have to understand sometimes that these enterprise customers are thinking of things that just don't necessarily come up in the context of a software company, especially a smaller one. And even if you're in a giant company, like, I guarantee you, for running their internal systems, a Google, a Microsoft, an Amazon. Think about all these same types of things these big enterprises do. But that doesn't mean that people writing software that those companies, deploy as a SaaS or ship to their customers think about that stuff at all. So it's just different mindset.
You're very right. And one thing that you mentioned SaaS, right? That just came to mind. Many people write their Helm charts, or a vendor would write their Helm chart for their SaaS product.
Mhm.
Now, there is always that assumption that the Helm chart works, and you've battle tested your Helm chart to work in that SaaS environment. And there are so many assumptions that have been collected over time as part of legacy and whatnot, and you just know that's how they work, that you wouldn't even think of looking at because you've just been doing it that way. You rightly said so. Labeling, for example, you label your artifacts in a certain way. You have all these annotations and metadata that is part of your workloads that you just, they work in a SaaS environment. Then you find yourself in an enterprise environment, and all of a sudden your written chart has so many other requirements that you hadn't thought of, and now you're in production somewhere. This is what, these are the kind of things that we see on a day-to-day basis. And, the blog that I posted there and a few other things, and, a talk that Diamond gave as well, does dive into those very specific. I mean, we are talking about your values need to look a very specific way. Your chart needs to be structured in a certain way. It's really detailed, and there are lots of gotchas there, and also the why we do that kind of conversations.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And you mentioned images before as well. There could be lots of requirements about where images come from. And if your chart and you're running a SaaS, you might just say, hey, it's hard coded that these things report to my ECR because where else is it going to come from? So, I think, if I look through the sort of, so image properties being configured, security context,
Mhm.
node selection and affinity, taints and tolerations, like those are again an area where like we might have some opinions about it because we did the architecture. But I think, there's probably some ideas out there at the end customers as well. Do you agree with that, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. I worked in enterprise environments before coming to Replicated. I never worked at a company that specifically catered to enterprise vendors before coming here. I mean, in a sense, yes, but not with the kind of focus on that Replicated has. So
Sure.
it's I have a lot of background uh, in idiomatic chart writing,
Hmm.
and solving the problems that a lot of people have because, having been a Helm maintainer for 8 years now or so, giving lots of talking to people at all the KubeCons and the different Kubernetes meetups, various events, dealing with issues in the issue queue, being on dev calls like weekly for all of that time. You hear a lot of stories, and a number of those people are from enterprise environments, but it's been really exciting and enriching, let me just say, for me to gain a lot of the expertise that folks here have had about working with enterprise clients specifically. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's where a lot of the content from this blog post came from is from folks here who've been basically like the Brett have had a very specific focus on Helm for enterprise clients. Yeah. So
What?
I guess the question or your question was um uh or I guess to answer your question, I think that um, there are really interesting peculiarities. You mentioned the images. I mean, just one other example is not only where your image registry is, but also where your artifact registry is if you're storing charts as OCI artifacts.
Hmm.
You know,
Yep.
even if you're just thinking about the dependencies of your chart and where they are.
That's a great point.
Yeah, it's not just for yeah, for essentially not just for one enterprise client, but for a vendor who has their own huge user base of clients, you know, and has to accommodate all of them. So
Yeah.
I find this really interesting territory, and it's exciting to learn about all of your expertise here and sort of merge mine.
Yeah, one of the things, and I'd like to think a little bit about like the Helm community and software vendors and large enterprises as sort of the next thing we look at. And there's a couple of things. We're talking about some challenges here, and there's actually one more challenge that I specifically see as sort of being different between the idioms for writing Helm charts and maybe what I might want as a software vendor, which is what values do I expose and why? I feel like as a software vendor, there are, you know, I want to sort of guide someone into change the fewest possible things in order to get running and be successful with my thing. And yet idiomatically in the Helm community, I think we we value we make all the things values. um and that to me has always been very interesting. So that's one example, but I'm sure there might be others. So I'd be curious, Scott and Evans both, given these types of things, these types of challenges, these types of impacts, are there things that the Helm core team and adjacent projects might think about and do differently, um, when if thinking more about this sort of commercial use of Helm to distribute to large enterprises, which is, again, probably not where it started. Um,
Correct.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so well, the interesting thing is uh maybe 30 seconds of some of the history of Helm values, as Helm values started out as just variable expansion, like environment variable expansion inside of
Hmm.
YAML. Um, it evolved from there because that was clearly you wanted more of a config style,
Hmm.
a config file style. And when charts are very simple, that works out really well. Um, config files have grown for Helm have grown to be kind of a mix of things for people. And I think I think for enterprise clients or people who want to install enterprise software who may not really know anything about Kubernetes, and you don't necessarily want them to or require
Right.
them to. Some do, but not necessarily, right? There's I think getting there are still ways to simplify your values, your default values file. And and also I think a lot of clients don't really know that they don't really need to modify the values file itself, but can use custom files. And so just to unpack those two ideas, excuse me, custom values files
Yeah.
contain them. And just to unpack that idea slightly and rather quickly, um, one way I think that values can be um, made a little easier is separating the values that are specific to the configurations for the application itself from the configurations that apply to Kubernetes specifically.
Hmm.
Um, you know,
That's
yeah.
that's really a good distinction to draw for sure.
Yeah, because in some cases, like say if you weren't running certain applications can only run on Kubernetes, right? They're built to be Kubernetes native. And so perhaps uh some of those distinctions are a little more blurry, or maybe they shouldn't even don't even have to be made. But in a lot of cases, that's not really necessarily the case. Um,
Mhm.
and you want to be able to configure your app in ways, let's say that an application team would want to do that are different than a platform team would want to do. And the Helm chart is really for installing, packaging, sharing, and installing applications on to run on Kubernetes. But there are kind of different levels of concern between the application layer and the infrastructure layer there. And I think if those were uh, uh, separated, for example, under like I don't know, an advanced settings area
Sure.
or a
Yeah.
platform really, that would be, there are several ways that could be done. And I think it has to be thought through for each application. So that's that one side of it. And the second side is, um, I think vendors could make it easier for clients to, or for users of that application to configure things that most maybe cover like the 90% use cases in example custom values files, um, and offer those as examples inside of your chart itself. So that and point to those in your documentation and say, hey, here's some examples of how a user would run, I don't know, like say a um, a leader election version of our, as opposed to a standalone,
Yeah.
version of
Yeah.
our database or our application. Here's an example of how, um, you want to, turn on and off these specific features. And those can be very, very clear and simple custom files that just, because I think a lot of people don't know um, uh, how Helm values work in the sense that you can chain values together and they deep merge. So
Yep.
I think that's fairly important because users probably only want to change a few things and not necessarily get bewildered by, the never-ending unscrolling of a, mile-long values file.
I mean, is there a world in which default values are something that there are multiple files containing within the chart? Um, like, is that a future we might see? Is that a solution to this?
You could with certain orchestration tools. I mean,
Hmm.
you can also just with pure Helm as long as you have the correct Helm commands to run, you know.
Yeah. But this still ends up being sort of the one default in the chart usually, right?
Correct. Correct. But what you
Is
can
it
do is you can
that
unpack.
something that ever gets talked about changing that, or
Um, th there have been people that have proposed something like that in the past, but it hasn't really I will say that that there is a history of Helm charts shipping with values files that are meant to be added in the Helm installation and upgrade commands.
okay.
Um, Nami did it for years. Um,
Yep.
when they were acquired by VMware, that that changed, but I think
Hmm.
it didn't change because the strategy for its use value changed. I believe it changed because, and this is documented publicly. So it changed because those values files claimed to be for production, and
Ah,
they realized, hey, wait a second, we have all these production product
yeah.
related products, and also um, one person's definition of production is different from the others. So we're going to back out of this entirely. Um, they could have alternatively just changed the name from production to, example HA or something like this. But yeah, like you can definitely do that and just give users the command to say, you know, Helm install, or upgrade dash dash values or dash F, um,
Yep.
you know, uh, environment or shared values or something like this, and you can chain them. There's some really like clear examples of how people use those. The one thing that I have considered for a long time that we don't do right now in Helm is allow you to point to, even in the Helm commands, to point to values files that are inside of your chart without unpacking the chart first.
Hmm.
uh that is something that could be added, and
Yeah.
it's a conversation that I'd love to hear feedback on. But right now you can still do that. You just need to do a Helm pull unpack your chart, and then you can still you can do it now today.
Cool. Yeah, that would be interesting. Cool. Evans, what about you? Is there any thoughts that you have as you know, here's things I wish we were doing differently in the community for these use cases, or
I think orchestration is one. So today you'd need external tooling such as Hemfire, Flux, Argo CD to orchestrate how your Helm charts get installed. So this is specific to not just the values, because I think we've covered that quite well. More on, I'd like to install my multiple Helm charts. Now,
sure,
enterprise software is never one Helm chart that installs a few resources, combination of many things. Your SaaS product is probably multiple applications that have been packaged by multiple teams, and that is what you want to end up in a customer's environment. We've seen cases where, an enterprise all of a sudden has a surge of, we need to install our software on-prem, and they just want to ship their SaaS product. So now, they have all these Helm charts that they have a CI/CD pipeline that deploys, and now they want to deploy in on-prem. Orchestration will be one thing that they hit a roadblock on. And that's one thing I'd like to see changed in Helm. And we are headed there. There's been a proposal in Helm 4 to introduce a way to improve how you orchestrate your Helm chart, your resource deployment. So they can be deployed. If you have a database that gets deployed, it's running before you have your application deployed. Or if you have some infrastructure level like SAP Manager or an ingress that gets deployed, or maybe not ingress, but SAP Manager or infrastructure level component storage, for example. You have OpenEBS running first, and you have all the other components coming later on. So that's an issue that enterprise software. Helm charts for enterprise into on-prem environments do face quite often, and there are all these loopholes that are ways to work around it, but then ugly.
So I know one of the answers for that is often to create an umbrella chart. I also know that there are certain things umbrella charts do pretty well, and certain things umbrella charts are challenged by. What would you recommend I do to be successful with an umbrella chart?
Well, going back to the example that Scott mentioned, separating infrastructure and application level artifacts, given the deficiency of Helm today, where you can't say, I need this thing fully deployed before this other thing fully deployed. With an umbrella chart, you need to package your components as an umbrella chart, but they do not need to depend on each other with regards to how you sequence their deployment. So that's on the umbrella chart side. Exposing certain components, certain bits of your umbrella chart via global values in your values file. That is also another thing that you as a vendor, you need to ensure your Helm chart is doing correctly. So if you have an umbrella chart and multiple charts, subcharts within that umbrella chart, there are certain bits of the subcharts that need to be configured. Do not forget to do that. So your values file needs to be adequate for configuration of enabling certain components of your Helm chart, perhaps modifying the behavior of certain parts of your Helm, your subcharts, exposing security context, exposing various aspects of your chart that we had talked about earlier that you may assume work. They may work in your SaaS environment, but won't definitely work in your enterprise environment of a customer.
I think what you mentioned about the global values really resonated with me, especially when you control all those charts, because you can have the subcharts, use some globals that get set in when you're setting values for the umbrella. And I just ran into this. I was helping one of the vendors we work with they had some things that embedded cluster was installing for them just as straight manifests. They weren't being installed by a chart. And I was moving those things into the chart and also trying to bring some of their dependencies from embedded cluster, orchestrating them to being in the chart. And I noticed there were a few places where something was of value in the chart that became the umbrella chart and needed to become a global value once I started doing that work. And that was, quite frankly, even though I've been, around these systems for a while, and this ecosystem for a while, something I should have expected but didn't at all. That sort of moving values into global aspect of creating umbrella. So I like that you brought that up, because I stubbed my toe on that one myself.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one part that as part of the global is also obviously one other bit that came to mind is referencing other resources. I think Secret is a good example. So in an enterprise and software, in an enterprise, certain sensitive data may be provisioned through different systems. Say, now think of your database credentials. You probably don't want to set them as username and password kind of values within your. Well, some people won't want to do that. They'll just want to drop a secret somewhere and say that's where the credentials are, and that can be deployed by a completely different workflow that is more elevated. And all your Helm chart will need is reference that a resource. Now, I am calling out that example because at times a subchart would have that responsibility of deploying a certain resource, Kubernetes resource. Now, when you think of say Cert Manager, right? Cert Manager deploys for you a certificate somewhere as a secret, and or a TLS credentials as a secret somewhere. You want to reference that from your Helm chart, from your other Helm chart. So these are the kind of things that you might hard code, but at times in certain environments, you want to ensure that it's configurable and can be picked from different sources.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that's, I was going to transition into sort of maybe some practical and tactical recommendations. We covered them, but a little bit as we went, but I thought maybe like bringing some of them together. But first I wanted to, Scott, it's something you and I have talked about around, orchestration umbrellas and how these work and how they don't work, and what is Helm for, and we've gotten very philosophical about it at times, I think. But umbrella charts, they're a good solution until they're not, right?
Correct. Here be dragons, or could be.
Yeah.
That's right. You put it perfectly. Some rules of thumb might be for deciding when to have a single umbrella chart for everything that you need for an application versus having versus orchestrating multiple charts. And bear in mind, those can work together. You can still use an umbrella chart strategy and have additional charts that need to be orchestrated together. It's not just a choice between having one or having 100 different charts, you know.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, and that's honestly how I generally do it. I umbrella as far as I can, and then I put a couple of charts before the umbrella if I need to.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know why you would, right? And so maybe one way I'd suggest for folks, I mean, obviously the answer is talk to us and we'll help you, but some rules of thumb are if you there are certain things that an umbrella chart really can't do or can't do well.
Hmm.
One is if you need different applications to run in different namespaces. So there are some times where you do want that. Um,
Hmm.
not always, right? But if a user is installing your application on their on a kind of bring your own cluster, right? On their existing infrastructure, some Kubernetes cluster, like Evan said, like, or you know, I don't know, could be an Amazon or Azure or Google. Um, Sometimes you don't need that, and they can install this like just on our embedded cluster, right? And in the embedded cluster, we completely control that. And so yeah, maybe shove most things in one namespace. But there are times where, for example, you wouldn't want to reinstall Cert Manager because you
Hmm.
are in a cluster, and Cert Manager is really ideally intended to be cluster wide to serve all of your different um, yeah, all of your different applications. Or let's say an ingress controller.
Yep.
You already have your ingress controller. You don't need this, right? That's where people are a little bit more advanced and they may want to fine tune those Kubernetes specific settings. But generally in charts where you have dependencies like an umbrella chart, you can handle some of those things if it's tolerant in general, like say on an embedded cluster to all go into one namespace, right? Helm charts are intended to install into one namespace. Um,
Yep.
then okay, fine, then have one umbrella chart, but give settings where you can disable those. You can choose to disable those dependencies and install them separately.
Yep.
That's something that is important to be able to do. And there are, when you do that, yeah, you can do it all manually. Um, but there are tools to uh, help you with that. So for example, Helm file is a very good no kind of a zero dependencies uh, tool in the Helm ecosystem to help you to help you manage multiple charts in a declarative way, either a single chart or multiple charts declaratively. But beyond the value of it being declarative itself, where you're, and by that I mean, you know, you not having to run the Helm commands with the specific um, the imperative commands to tell it to do specific things. Um, you simply, you know, run a Helm file command, and all of the things that you want your final state to be on your system is all declared. The benefit of doing that is that you can have values in certain things that you declare as a custom values file, but in the Helm file itself, and those can all apply to, they can be shared. So if you have, you know, let's say, you know, Evans mentioned a secret. Well, if you want multiple services or multiple charts, say, to share the same secret, um, you can do that easily with a tool like that. You can also do it with there are other tools in the ecosystem. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
And
yeah,
if you're not if this is an area where I think a lot of people will use our embedded cluster to handle that orchestration,
yeah,
in addition to all the other benefits it has that we talked about in the previous deep dive. But they'll often use it to handle that type of orchestration and bringing all those things together.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah, and
yeah.
as Evan mentioned, the secrets handling. This is an example that where where whether you add that to an umbrella chart or you have that as a separately managed chart because let's say you use something like external secrets operator so that you can
Hmm.
store your secrets
Yeah.
in your cloud, like in the tools that are given to you at an enterprise level by the cloud providers themselves if you are doing a bring your own cluster. You may not want to install that again in an umbrella chart, if you already have that running in its own namespace in your cluster. Things like that. And you may want to use those settings. So I think there's one piece of this that you mentioned before about at the very beginning, Chuck, that relates to this about values files really allowing you to configure everything in the entire universe.
Yep.
Well, so for currently today, you ultimately there are two ways to do this with Helm 3. You either do what you mentioned and give people all the options, and then when people ask for new options, you just template in more options because it works with and then
Yep.
you do what you see with Benami charts. That the reason those look like that is because they have had customers using them for many years, and every time someone asks to template something new, they can just open a pull request and do that, or just ask them to do that and they will do it. And so you essentially have what looks like just a lot of gobbledygook, lots of like Go YAML statements inside of, or sorry,
Yeah.
Go template statements inside of like giant YAML files with like many, with sort of like if else tree hell,
Sure is.
Yeah, hard to debug, hard to reason about. You can also use with Helm 3, you can also use post renderers. And I think that's an important thing for people to look at because an enterprise client could add uh let's say example customized patches inside of an examples folder in their chart as well, and
Hmm.
ask people to post to do a simple post rendering with those,
Good
and
point.
and allow advanced users who would be the people who would want all this extra stuff to say, oh, I can write my own patch and I can just use a post render. I don't have to shove this into templates because basically what post rendering is, for those who don't know, is after Helm does all of its manifest generation and is about to send those to the Kube API, it gives you the option to specify a post renderer, which is just a binary that could then modify that. So you
Yep.
could add in whatever you want or subtract things, etc. Um, and that is one good tool to keeping your charts a little bit more simple. And if you need the main challenge, I think, is how to allow your clients to use that easily. And just one suggestion here is that the rule of thumb there is that if you do want to do something like that, really target your advanced users because only your advanced users are going to be using post renderer.
It's a
Um,
really good point.
so just so you could leave out the super advanced stuff potentially and offer them that option. What's coming in Helm 4, however, is an alternative, basically alternative engines to Go template to allow, we're looking at, for example, a project by the creators of YAML called, the project is called YAML script, and that is valid YAML, fits the valid YAML spec, that it allows you to do things like have functions and things that are very similar to what you put in Go templating, but just it would allow users to learn very basic syntax for YAML script and then make their modifications through the values file itself. So that's another really interesting thing that you can't do today. Well, you can. There is a project to use that with post rendering, but we're really not pushing folks to do that today. But that's something that you, at least for now, can follow as we're working toward Helm 4 and look forward to other opportunities.
Great. All right.
Question
Oh,
here. Sorry about that.
yeah, go
Can I,
ahead.
so in Helm 4, is there any plan to bring up something for the values file? Because sometimes values file can be complex, like you guys are discussing, that can have many components because our enterprise customers want to, install them in certain way, or you want to use certain tools in it, like maybe a different load balancer on GCP or AWS or things like that, or maybe Ingress. So right now, when they actually deploy it, some of them are happy with chords, have a nice UI, but people, users who are using Helm deployment, they see the value files, a big amount of variables they need to pass, and they get worried at what do we need to pass. So is there a plan to sort out that or somehow overcome
Well,
that?
that's one of the things I was mentioning, that with using a different tool than GoTemplate, the idea would be tools that don't require you to template every change. The idea would be that you can actually you could then make modifications to that to those manifests without it having to be templated. So that I think would help solve a lot of what you're saying. That's part of the idea. And just so you know, we had considered this years ago when we were when Helm 3 was being designed. We were actually looking at Lua at that time as a solution to replace Go templating. And there were just several reasons why we didn't go that route. Mostly it was the community was like, don't change my Go templating, we love it. And I think at this point now, the entire community has pretty much come around to it is like Helm is the best way to do this for the vast majority of users today.
Right.
To be able to manage otherwise lots of YAML with lots of repeating keys that all have to match and all this other stuff. There are other tools to use besides Helm, but it is the most common tool. And so we just accept Go templating in YAML because that's what we have. But I think most people have come around now to saying, hey, if you have another alternative that would allow me to make changes without you having to like keep adding more and more Go templating inside of YAML, we would love this, right? So that's why we're really looking at that for Helm 4 now. And we'd love
Awesome.
more of your feedback if you are interested in kind of early beta testing or alpha testing. Our pre-release for Helm 4 is scheduled for August. So that would be a time, hopefully at that point, where you'll have at least something to look at and something to play with if you want to be an early feedback user.
Cool. All right. We are up against our deadline of time here. I do want to thank everybody here for a great conversation. Ali, I hope this was beneficial for you to jump in. I actually got a lot out of hearing Evans and Scott and thoughts on some of these things, and I feel like every time I chat with Scott, I remember post renderers again. And so, but thank you very much. And we'll be putting together some more material from this. There'll be a recording available and a blog post. So if it's something that can be shared around with others. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.